The rope was coarse hemp, thick as a man's wrist, thrown over a thick limb of the cottonwood. It hung against the pale bark, a stark line between the blue sky and the dusty ground of the town square. Mara stood on the back of a wagon, her hand bound tight behind her. The sun beat down hot on the back of her neck. She faced the crowd, their faces a wall of hard angles and set jaws. The accusation hung in the air, heavier than the heat. Rustling cattle, a crime she didn't commit. The town's bias was a physical force, a collective disbelief that a woman alone could run a spread, let alone be innocent. The sheriff adjusted the noose, his movements final. This was frontier justice. Quick, brutal, and wrong. The trouble had started at first light, with the dew still silver on the grass. Mara was mending a break in the corral fence, the rhythm of hammer on nail a familiar comfort. The sound of approaching horses was not. Sheriff Pike led the group, his face grim. Behind him rode 3 men from the Bar W spread, their expressions dark with the anger that had been riding for miles. They didn't dismount. Pike spoke flatly. "Mara, we found one of Henderson's steers, carrying your brand." The words didn't make sense at first. Her brand, the simple M cross, was burned deep into the hide of a steer from a herd 30 miles away. They'd found it wandering near the canyon. The evidence was irrefutable, they said. "That's impossible," Mara said, her voice tight. She wiped her hands on her trousers. "My cattle are all accounted for. Every head." One of the Bar W men spat into the dust. "A woman's tally, easy to lose count when you're busy with woman's work." The dismissal was like a slap. It was the same disbelief she'd faced since Tom died, leaving her, the ranch. A woman trying to do a man's job. She'd built this place from near ruin after the fever took him, her hands growing calloused, her back learning a permanent ache. She'd buried her grief in the soil, in the relentless labor of survival. She'd built a life alone. But to them, she was still just a widow, an easy target, a convenient scapegoat. There was no investigation, she argued, her temper rising to match the morning heat. "You just rode straight here." "The brand's the investigation," Pike said, his voice weary. He was a man who preferred quiet, and this was the opposite. "Henderson's missing 50 head. This ain't the time for a trial. This is the time for an example." The call for a hanging came from the Bar W men, frontier justice, swift to deter others. The decision was made in minutes, there in her own yard, with her own hammer gone cold in her hand. They took her, not roughly, but with a firm, impersonal grip that was worse than violence. They led her away from the ranch she'd bled for, the accusation a stain she couldn't scrub off. The jailhouse was a single room of rough-hewn timber, smelling of old sweat and dust. The cot was a thin pad on a wooden frame. A single high window, barred, showed a narrow slice of the darkening sky. Mara sat on the edge of the cot, her bound wrists resting in her lap. Outside, the murmur of the mob ebbed and flowed. A bottle broke against the wall. A man laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. This was the armor cracking. The careful self-reliance she'd forged over 2 hard years. Alone in the dark, the walls felt like they were pressing in. She thought of Tom, not the strong man who'd built their home, but the quiet one in the lamplight, his hand covering hers on the table. The vulnerability she had buried with him under the oak tree on the hill rose up now, a cold tide in her cheek. She had armored herself against the land, the weather, the loneliness. But not against this, not against the collective will of a town that saw her as a problem to be solved. Hours blurred. The moon rose, casting a pale stripe across the dirt floor. Then a different sound, a soft scratching at the door. Not the mob. The small slot for food slid open. A hand pushed through a tin plate with a slice of bread, a wedge of cheese, then another hand placing a small bar of preserves beside it. No words were spoken, but the gesture was clear. Later, as the night deepened, she heard the whisper. "Mara." It was Sarah from the farm down the creek. Her voice was so low it was almost lost in the creak of the settling building. "We know it's a lie." Another voice, younger. "Eliza. They're wrong. Everyone knows you're no rustler." It was a fragile lifeline thrown across the darkness, a sisterhood of women who understood the struggle, the constant fight to be seen as capable. Their belief was a quiet defiance, a currency more valuable than any shouted protest. They couldn't stop the wagon at dawn, but they could bear witness. They could let her know she wasn't alone. In that silence, a strange calm settled over her. The armor was cracked, but something else was seeping through the breaks. It wasn't hope. That was too flimsy a thing. It was a colder, harder certainty. She had trusted only herself for so long, equating trust with a weakness that could get you killed. But these whispers in the dark, this silent solidarity, it wasn't weakness. It was a different kind of strength, a shared strength. She leaned her head back against the cold wall, listening. The mob's noise seemed farther away now, less substantial than the truth being passed hand to hand through a slot in a door. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, purple and gray bleeding into the horizon. They came for her before the sun had fully cleared the hills. The air was cold, carrying the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. The crowd was larger now, a silent, shifting mass gathered around the cottonwood. The wagon was back in place. The rope was still there. Mara's feet were unsteady on the rough planks of the wagon bed. Her hands, still bound, felt numb. Sheriff Pike stood beside her, his face a mask of grim duty. He didn't look at her. He read the charge in a voice that carried over the hushed assembly. Cattle rustling, theft of 50 head from the Bar W. The penalty, death by hanging. The words were formal, empty. This was no trial. This was theater, a performance of justice for a verdict already decided. She was given a chance to speak. Her voice, when it came, was quieter than she intended, scraped raw from the night. I didn't do this. That was all. There was no point in a grand speech. The truth was simple. It was the lie that was complicated. Her words fell into the silence and vanished, like a stone dropped in a deep well. The faces in the crowd remained hard, unmoved. A woman's denial against a man's brand. There was no contest. It was then that a new sound cut through the morning stillness. The rhythmic beat of a single horse, ridden hard. All heads turned. A rider came down the main street, his horse lathered, dust swirling around its hooves. He pulled up at the edge of the crowd, his presence causing a ripple of recognition. It was Elias Henderson, the owner of the missing cattle, the man who had the most right to demand this hanging. He dismounted, his movements stiff from the long ride. His face was weathered, etched with lines of sun and responsibility. He walked toward the wagon, his eyes scanning the scene, the sheriff, the noose, Mara standing there. The crowd parted for him, expectant. They waited for him to confirm it, to give the final nod, to see his vengeance served. He stopped a few feet from the wagon. His gaze was not on the sheriff, nor on the rope. It was fixed on Mara. He studied her face, the set of her jaw, the dark circles under her eyes. Then his eyes dropped to her hands still tied behind her back. He looked at them for a long moment, at the calluses, the broken nails, the ingrained dirt that no amount of washing could ever fully remove. The hands of someone who worked. Not the clever, sly hands of a rustler who would expertly alter a brand, but the honest, brutalized hands of a rancher. Pike broke the silence. Elias, we're about done here. Justice for your loss. Elias didn't answer immediately. He finally looked away from Mara, his eyes sweeping over the crowd, then back to the sheriff. My loss, he repeated, his voice low but carrying. That steer you found, the one with their brand. That's right, ironclad. Too ironclad, Elias said. The words hung in the air. A man steals 50 head, he's smart or he's greedy, but he's not stupid enough to let one wander off, straight back toward the spread he stole it from, carrying the one piece of evidence that points right to him. He paused, letting the simplicity of it settle. Unless he wanted it to be found. Unless the point wasn't to steal my cattle, but to get rid of her. A murmur went through the crowd. The simple, clean narrative of guilt began to fracture. The bloodlust that had sustained them through the cold night wavered, replaced by a dawning uncertainty. Elias Henderson wasn't here for vengeance. He was here with a question. Elias turned his back on the gallows, addressing the crowd directly now. I rode out before dawn to the canyon where you found that steer. He gestured toward Mara. She said she didn't do it. I decided to see if the land agreed with her. He described what he'd found. The tracks leading away from the canyon weren't the confused trail of a single stray animal. They were part of a larger, driven path, the tracks of 50 head, moving with purpose. And alongside them, the clear imprint of shod horses. Not the casual pattern of a lone rider, but the organized movement of a group. The trail didn't lead toward Mara's land. It led east toward the Badlands, toward a known hideout used by Jake Rourke and his men. The brand on that steer, Elias continued, his voice gaining strength. It's her M-Cross, yes, but it's fresh. Too fresh. The hide was still raw around the edges. A rebranding job, done in a hurry, a frame. He looked at Pike. You didn't look because you didn't need to. The answer was convenient. Then he turned back to Mara. His demeanor was no longer cold, but intensely focused. You know this land better than any of us. The draws, the water holes a stranger would miss. Where would Rourke push a herd that size? He'd need water. He'd need cover. Mara felt the eyes of the town on her. This was a test as real as the noose. Her knowledge, the very thing they dismissed as insufficient, was now the key. She thought of the labyrinth of arroyos and mesas to the east. There's a box canyon, she said, her voice clearer now. About 10 miles into the Badlands, spring-fed pool at the back. The entrance is narrow, hidden by a stand of pinons. It's where we wintered stock during the big blizzard 2 years back. She didn't say we as in her and Tom. She said it as a rancher stating a fact. Elias nodded, a spark of respect in his eyes. That's where the tracks were pointing. The dynamic shifted completely. The mob was gone, replaced by a posse. Sheriff Pike, his authority challenged, but his duty clear, gave the order. They would ride. Mara's ropes were cut. The rough hemp fell away, the feeling rushing back into her hands in a painful, prickling wave. She didn't look at the cottonwood branch as she climbed down from the wagon. She accepted the rifle Pike handed her, its familiar weight a comfort. They rode out together, Elias, Pike, a handful of townsmen, and Mara. The sun was high now, hot on their backs. The ride was silent, but for the sound of hooves on hardpan. They rode as allies, bound by a common purpose. Mara led them, her eyes reading the land like a map, pointing out the subtle signs Elias had missed. A broken branch, a scatter of dung that was still moist. It was a different kind of labor, a shared tracking, and with every mile, the unspoken alliance solidified in the dust and the heat. They found the herd in the box canyon, just as she'd said. The cattle were milling around the green-fringed pool, and they found Jake Rourke and 2 of his men lounging by a low fire, confident in their ruse. The confrontation was short, sharp. The evidence was irrefutable. Rourke, seeing Mara standing with the sheriff and Henderson, his plan in ruins, cursed her with a venom that confirmed everything. Justice, this time the real kind, was served not at the end of a rope, but with the cold click of handcuffs. The stolen cattle were recovered. The truth, hard and clear as the noonday sun, was finally laid bare. The ride back to her ranch was made in a silence that was no longer heavy with accusation, but filled with the mummed, unspoken things that now lay between them. Elias rode beside her, not leading, not following, just there. When they reached her land, the familiar sight of the barn and the small cabin under the wide sky felt different. The rope's shadow was gone. The weight that had pressed on her shoulders since Tom's death, the weight of pure, unadulterated solitude, had shifted. It wasn't gone, but it was no longer hers to carry alone. He dismounted with her, his eyes taking in the mended corral, the neat stack of firewood, the stubborn resilience of the place. You've done well here, he said, his voice quiet. It wasn't pity, it was an assessment, the kind one rancher gives another. I've managed, she replied, the old armor trying to snap back into place. He nodded toward the horizon, toward the Westaman empty range that separated their spreads. That land between us. Good grazing. Too much for one, not enough for 2 to fight over. He looked at her, his gaze direct. Might be just right for a partnership. The word hung in the air. Partnership. Not a rescue, not charity. A recognition. An offer based on the skill she'd shown in the Badlands, on the strength he'd seen in her eyes on the wagon. It was a choice, a door opening where before there had only been a wall. She didn't answer with words. She walked to the tool shed and took out an extra hammer. She handed it to him. Then she picked up a post and started toward the section of fence that still needed mending. He understood. He took the other end. The work was hard, the sun relentless, but it was a new rhythm, the sound of two hammers falling in alternating strikes, a shared labor. That evening she cooked, a simple stew. He sat at her table, the same table where Tom had once sat. The space felt strange, occupied, but not wrong. They ate without speaking much, the clink of spoons against bowls the only conversation. It was a tentative trust, as fragile and necessary as a green shoot after a fire. The lock on her door remained unbolted that night. Weeks bled into a month. The partnership was a practical, quiet thing. They pooled their resources, their knowledge. The herd grew stronger. The land between their ranches lost its invisible fence and became a shared responsibility. The work was the same backbreaking labor, but the isolation was gone. The sisterhood of women who had whispered through the jailhouse slot became a visible network. Sarah and Eliza would ride over, and the four of them would mend tack or put up preserves, the air filled with talk of crops and cattle and things other than survival. Mara's exterior was still tough. Her hands were still calloused, her gaze still direct. That was who she was, but the armor was no longer a sealed suit. It was like her cabin door, which now often stood open to the morning air. It was a calculated risk, this trust, not a flaw in her defenses, but a strategic alliance. The landscape was unchanged, the same harsh, beautiful, demanding land. But her place in it was redefined. She was no longer the solitary widow on the hill, a problem for the town to solve. She was a rancher, a partner, a woman who had faced the rope and, through a mix of her own grit and an unexpected ally, had earned a peace that was more than just the absence of noise. It was the quiet satisfaction of a shared sunrise, of a future that was no longer a solitary fight against the elements, but a built thing, constructed post by post, day by day, with someone who saw the strength in her hands. The cottonwood stood silent in the town square, its branches empty, a witness to justice finally found. Subscribe for more tales of resilience and quiet strength from the heartland.